the Bonfire Night Conspiracy. Welcome to Mindful Musings, where we explore mysteries that warm the heart and sharpen the mind. I'm your host, William, and tonight I invite you to join me in the charming village of St. Mary Mead, where even the most innocent traditions can harbour dark secrets. Our story unfolds through the observant eyes of Miss Jane Marple, whose quiet wisdom has solved many a puzzle that baffled younger, more impetuous minds. So settle into your favourite chair, perhaps with a cup of tea, and let us begin our tale of fire, fury, and the lengths to which ordinary people will go when pushed to extraordinary measures. Chapter 1. Sparks in the autumn air. The November evening carried that particular chill that announces winter's approach, and Miss Jane Marple pulled her wool cardigan more snugly about her shoulders as she made her way across the village green. The 5th of November had arrived with its usual festive anticipation, and St. Mary Mead was preparing for its annual Guy Fawkes night celebration with characteristic enthusiasm. Coloured bunting stretched between the ancient oak trees, and the massive bonfire at the centre of the green towered impressively against the darkening sky. Miss Marple had agreed to attend the celebration with her great-niece Diana, who had travelled down from London for the weekend. The young woman walked beside her now, chattering excitedly about childhood memories of similar celebrations. Miss Marple listened with half an ear, her attention caught by the activity around the bonfire, where several village men were making final preparations. At the heart of the preparations stood Mr. Reginald Blackwood, a prosperous businessman whose recent arrival in St. Mary Mead had caused considerable disruption to the village's peaceful rhythms. He was a tall man with an imposing bearing, his expensive overcoat setting him apart from the more modestly dressed villagers. Beside him, propped against a wooden frame, stood an elaborate Guy Fawkes effigy that Miss Marple had to admit was impressively crafted. "Quite magnificent, wouldn't you say, Miss Marple?" called out Vicar Clement as he approached, rubbing his hands together against the cold. "Mr. Blackwood has been most generous in providing such a fine Guy for tonight's celebration, far superior to the rather shabby affairs we've managed in previous years." Miss Marple murmured something politely agreeable, though her keen blue eyes continued to study the scene before her. There was something in the set of people's shoulders, in the way conversations seemed to still as Mr. Blackwood passed, that suggested tensions beneath the festive surface. She had lived in St. Mary Mead long enough to recognise when village harmony had been disturbed. Young Tommy Belden, a earnest boy of perhaps 14 who helped with odd jobs around the village, was assisting Mr. Blackwood in securing the Guy to its frame. The lad's face showed the concentration of someone given an important responsibility, and Miss Marple watched with grandmotherly approval as he worked with methodical care. "I must say, Aunt Jane," Diana whispered, leaning close, "there seems to be rather an atmosphere here. Have I missed some village drama?" Her eyes sparkled with the urban dweller's amused fascination with small-town politics. "Mr. Blackwood has proposed certain developments," Miss Marple replied quietly, "that have not met with universal approval, but surely tonight we can set aside such disagreements and enjoy the celebration as we always have." Even as she spoke, however, Miss Marple noticed Mrs. Pemberton standing at the edge of the green, her arms crossed tightly across her chest as she stared at Mr. Blackwood with unconcealed hostility. The Pemberton family had lived in their cottage facing the green for generations, and Miss Marple knew that such roots ran deep in a place like St. Mary Mead. The autumn wind picked up, carrying with it the scent of wood smoke from earlier preparations, and the distant sound of children's laughter as they played with sparklers under watchful parental eyes. The scene should have been one of pure community joy, yet Miss Marple could not shake the feeling that something was amiss. Mr. Blackwood consulted his pocket watch and called out instructions in his authoritative manner. The burning of the Guy was scheduled for 8 o'clock precisely, he announced, and he wanted everything ready well in advance. Several villagers exchanged glances at his tone, which suggested he was accustomed to giving orders and having them obeyed without question. As Miss Marple and Diana found a spot to watch the proceedings, she reflected on what she knew of Mr. Blackwood's controversial proposal. The housing development he championed would transform the village green into a modern residential complex, complete with dozens of new homes. The project would bring revenue to the village, Blackwood argued, and attract younger families to revitalise what he termed St Mary Mead's ageing population. What he did not mention, and what every villager knew, was that 6 families whose homes bordered the green would lose their properties to make way for the development. The cottages would be demolished and the families displaced. Such upheaval was unprecedented in the village's long history, and the opposition had been fierce and vocal. Miss Marple watched as Tommy Belden continued his work, adjusting the guy's clothing and checking the stability of the wooden frame. The boy's movements were careful and deliberate, showing proper respect for the task entrusted to him. It was this very carefulness that would, within moments, prevent a catastrophe that might have scarred the village forever. Chapter 2. The Discovery in the Straw. The village green had filled considerably by 7:45, with families clustered in cheerful groups around the towering bonfire. Children waved sparklers that traced golden patterns against the darkening sky, and the smell of toffee apples and roasted chestnuts hung temptingly in the cold air. Miss Marple accepted a cup of mulled wine from Diana, more for the warmth it provided her chilled hands than for any desire to drink it. She had positioned herself where she could observe the proceedings clearly, her practised eye taking in the various players in what she sensed might prove to be more than a simple celebration. Mr. Blackwood stood near the Guy effigy, checking his pocket watch again with the impatience of a man accustomed to punctuality. Tommy Belden remained nearby, making what appeared to be final adjustments to the Guy's position. "Everything must be perfect," Mr. Blackwood was saying to anyone who would listen. "I've gone to considerable expense to have this Guy professionally made. It should provide quite the spectacle when we set it alight." There was something in his tone that suggested he was already imagining the gratitude and admiration his gift would inspire, perhaps softening opposition to his development plans. It was at precisely 7:45 that disaster was narrowly averted, though the significance of the moment would not be immediately apparent to most observers. Tommy Belden, in his careful attention to detail, had noticed that one of the Guy's sleeves had come partially detached from its stuffing. Being a conscientious lad, he decided to adjust it before the burning ceremony began. Miss Marple watched as Tommy grasped the sleeve to reposition it, and saw the fabric tear in his hands with unexpected ease. The boy stumbled slightly, and what had been inside the Guy's arms spilled onto the ground in a cascade of colour and cylindrical shapes that were decidedly not straw. For a moment there was silence as Tommy stared at what had fallen. Then his face went white, and he shouted with a volume that carried across the entire green, "Stop! Everyone get back! There's fireworks inside the Guy!" The effect was immediate and chaotic. Parents grabbed children and pulled them away from the bonfire. Men rushed forward to investigate, then stopped abruptly when they saw what Tommy had discovered. Mr. Blackwood himself went deathly pale, his earlier confidence evaporating as he stared at the exposed interior of the effigy he had donated. Miss Marple moved closer, her curiosity overcoming the general instinct to retreat. What she saw made her blood run cold. The Guy was indeed stuffed with fireworks, but these were not the modest variety used in garden displays. They were professional-grade explosives, wired together with what appeared to be considerable expertise. The quantity alone suggested that if the effigy had been set alight as planned, the resulting explosion would have been catastrophic. Vicar Clement had taken charge with admirable presence of mind, his voice rising above the confused murmurs. "Everyone please move to the far side of the green. Quickly now, but no need to panic. Mrs. Pritchard, would you telephone? For the police immediately?" His usual gentle demeanour had been replaced by firm authority, and the villagers responded accordingly. Miss Marple found herself standing beside Edward Pemberton, who had rushed forward with the other men but now stood frozen, staring at the exposed fireworks with an expression that was difficult to read. His wife had already hurried their children away, but he seemed rooted to the spot. "Most peculiar," Miss Marple murmured, as much to herself as to anyone listening. "One wonders how such dangerous materials came to be inside the Guy." She watched Edward Pemberton carefully, noting how his hands clenched and unclenched at his sides. "Blackwood must have done it himself," someone in the crowd suggested loudly, "trying to create a spectacle that would make everyone forget about his bloody development plans. Nearly killed us all in the process." But Miss Marple's keen mind was already working through the logic of that accusation. Mr. Blackwood had personally delivered the guy to the celebration site. He had been standing directly beside it when Tommy made the discovery. If the effigy had exploded as apparently intended, Blackwood himself would have been among the casualties. Why would a man engineer an explosion that would almost certainly kill him? The sound of approaching sirens cut through the November air, and within minutes the village green was filled with police cars and a bomb disposal unit summoned from the nearest military base. The celebration was cancelled, of course, and the villagers dispersed to their homes in small, subdued groups, their festive mood thoroughly dampened by the near catastrophe they had witnessed. Miss Marple remained at the green longer than most, observing the efficient work of the bomb disposal experts and listening to the questions asked by Inspector Craddock, who had arrived from the nearby town. Young Tommy Belden was praised repeatedly for his quick thinking and for discovering the explosives before they could be detonated. As she finally made her way home with Diana, Miss Marple's mind was already cataloguing the questions that needed answers. The most pressing among them was not who had created the explosive guy, but rather who the intended victim had been. For despite the assumption that this was an attempt at mass murder, Miss Marple's instincts suggested something more targeted was at work. "What an evening!" Diana exclaimed, still shaken by the close call. "Who would do such a thing, Aunt Jane? In a place like St. Mary Mead?" "That, my dear," Miss Marple replied quietly, "is precisely what we must discover." Chapter 3. Voices Raised in Anger. The morning following the cancelled celebration brought Inspector Craddock to Miss Marple's door, his expression grave and his notebook ready for what she had come to recognise as an informal consultation. Despite his official position, the inspector had learned over the years that Miss Marple's observations often proved more valuable than conventional police work. The bomb disposal team confirms that the explosive-filled guy would have created a blast radius of at least 30 feet, he explained, accepting the tea Miss Marple offered. At least 20 people would have been killed or seriously injured if it had detonated as planned. This wasn't some prank gone wrong, Miss Marple. Someone intended mass murder. Miss Marple stirred her tea thoughtfully, her blue eyes contemplating the problem from several angles. "And yet, Inspector, one must consider the curious circumstances of the guy's delivery. Mr. Blackwood himself transported it from his warehouse to the village green 2 days before Bonfire night. Rather than leaving it in storage until the last moment, he brought it to the celebration site early. Why would someone planning mass murder make such a choice?" Inspector Craddock consulted his notes, frowning. "We've questioned Mr. Blackwood extensively. He claims he had the guy professionally made by a firm in London, as he wanted to make a good impression on the village. The effigy was delivered to his warehouse 2 weeks ago, and he'd been storing it there until deciding, quite spontaneously, to bring it to the green ahead of schedule. He says he wanted to ensure everything was properly set up in advance." "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "So the guy spent 2 weeks in Mr. Blackwood's warehouse, where presumably only he had regular access. Then he personally transported it to a public location where dozens of people would be present when it was set alight. The logic troubles me, Inspector." The inspector leaned forward, his interest piqued by her line of reasoning. "You're suggesting Blackwood wasn't the perpetrator?" "I'm suggesting that if one intended to cause an explosion, there are far more efficient methods than packing a guy with explosives and then personally delivering it to a crowded celebration. Consider instead what might have happened if Mr. Blackwood had not moved the guy early. It would have remained in his warehouse until Bonfire night, where he would have been working alone to prepare materials for the celebration." Inspector Craddock's expression shifted as he grasped the implication. "You think Blackwood was the intended victim, not the perpetrator. The explosion was meant to occur in his warehouse, making it look like an accident with fireworks storage." "It's a possibility worth considering," Miss Marple replied, "particularly given the considerable opposition Mr. Blackwood has faced regarding his development plans. I believe you'll find that several families have made rather intemperate statements about stopping him by any means necessary." The inspector's subsequent investigation revealed just how heated the controversy had become. The 6 families whose homes bordered the village green had formed a united front against Blackwood's development, and their campaign had grown increasingly desperate as the project moved toward approval. At a parish council meeting 2 weeks earlier, Edward Pemberton had stood and declared that Blackwood's development would be built over his dead body. Mrs. Fletcher, whose family had lived in her cottage since Victorian times, had told the local newspaper that someone should burn down Blackwood's plans before he burns down our community. Mr. Davies, the retired schoolmaster, had been heard in the pub saying that accidents happen to people who threaten what we hold dear. Each statement, taken individually, might be dismissed as empty rhetoric born of frustration. Taken together, they painted a picture of a community driven to extremes by what they perceived as an existential threat to their way of life. Inspector Craddock compiled a list of suspects that included all 6 families, though his attention focused particularly on those with known expertise in explosives or electrical work. Miss Marple, however, was drawn to the Pemberton family for reasons that went beyond Edward's public threats. She had observed the family's particular desperation, rooted in circumstances that made the development especially devastating for them. Through discreet conversations with other villagers, she learned details that painted a heartbreaking picture. The Pemberton cottage had been in the family for 6 generations, each inheriting it from the previous. Edward's mother, now 86 and suffering from advancing dementia, had been born in that cottage and lived there her entire life. In her lucid moments, she repeatedly expressed her wish to die in the house where she had been born, a wish that Edward had promised to honour. If Blackwood's development proceeded, the cottage would be demolished within 6 months. The family would be forced to relocate, and Edward's mother would need to be moved to a care facility, as the family could not afford to purchase property in the new development. Edward had confided to friends that he believed the forced relocation would kill his mother, that the shock of leaving her lifelong home would be more than her fragile health could withstand. Desperation makes people capable of actions they would never otherwise contemplate, Miss Marple observed to Diana over breakfast. When someone believes they're fighting not just for their home, but for their mother's life, the moral calculations become tragically skewed. Diana looked troubled. Are you saying you sympathise with whoever planted those explosives? Aunt Jane, they nearly killed dozens of people. I sympathise with no one who plans murder, Miss Marple replied firmly. But I do try to understand the human heart with all its capacity for both love and violence. Understanding does not mean condoning, my dear. It means recognising that even good people can convince themselves that terrible actions are justified when they believe they're protecting those they love. Chapter 4. Licenses and Ledgers. Inspector Craddock returned to Miss Marple's cottage 2 days after the discovery of the explosive guy, his expression suggesting he had uncovered something significant. He declined tea this time, too restless to sit for long as he shared his findings. We've been investigating who had access to the type of fireworks found in the guy, he explained, pacing before Miss Marple's fireplace. These weren't ordinary consumer fireworks that anyone might purchase. They're professional-grade explosives, the sort used in major public displays. One needs a special license to acquire them. Miss Marple set down her knitting, her full attention now on the inspector. And you've discovered that someone in St. Mary Mead holds such a license? Edward Pemberton, Craddock confirmed. He runs a corporate events business that includes organising fireworks displays. He's licensed to purchase and store professional-grade fireworks, and his workshop contains materials that could easily be used to wire together the type of explosive device we found in the guy. The revelation did not surprise Miss Marple, though it confirmed suspicions she had been harbouring. I see. And have you questioned Mr. Pemberton about this? Not yet. I wanted to gather more evidence first. The inspector consulted his notebook. We've also examined the wiring used to connect the fireworks. It's a specific type of electrical cable commonly used in theatrical lighting and event production. We traced purchases of this exact cable type and found that Pemberton bought a significant quantity 3 months ago. Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind working through the implications. 3 months ago would coincide with when Mr. Blackwood's development proposal began to gain traction with the council. The timing is suggestive, though not conclusive. Has Mr. Pemberton's computer been examined? Inspector Craddock looked impressed by the question. We obtained a warrant this morning. The digital forensics team is analysing it now, though I'm told the initial findings are troubling. Pemberton's search history includes multiple inquiries about warehouse fires, fireworks storage accidents, and methods for disguising deliberate explosions as accidents. The picture being painted was damning, yet Miss Marple found herself troubled by certain aspects of the evidence. It seemed almost too convenient, too obvious. A man planning murder with sufficient sophistication to create an explosive device that might convincingly pass as an accident would surely have the sense to clear his computer's search history. "Inspector," she said carefully, "has anyone examined Mr. Blackwood's warehouse more closely, specifically where the guy was stored for those 2 weeks?" Craddock paused in his pacing, considering the question. "We gave it a preliminary inspection, but focused mainly on tracking who had access." "Why do you ask?" "Because if my theory is correct, and the explosion was meant to occur in the warehouse rather than at the public celebration, there might be evidence of how the perpetrator gained access. Mr. Blackwood presumably keeps his warehouse secured. How would someone plant an explosive device inside without his knowledge?" The inspector immediately saw the relevance of this line of inquiry. "I'll have a team conduct a thorough examination of the warehouse security. If there are signs of forced entry or unauthorized access, it would strengthen the case considerably." Miss Marple resumed her knitting, the needles clicking with steady rhythm as she thought. "You mentioned that Mr. Pemberton is licensed to handle professional fireworks. Does his license require him to maintain records of his inventory? Surely explosives of that grade must be carefully accounted for." "We're obtaining those records now," Craddock confirmed. "Though if he intended to use the fireworks criminally, he may have falsified his inventory reports." "Perhaps, though falsifying such records is itself a serious crime, adding unnecessary risk to an already dangerous plan. I wonder if the inventory might tell us something unexpected." Miss Marple paused in her knitting. "Inspector, when you question Mr. Pemberton, as you inevitably must, I would be interested to learn not just what he says, but how he says it." A man planning premeditated murder over several months might be expected to have prepared his responses to questioning. But a man acting from desperate love for his dying mother might reveal himself through emotional responses rather than calculated ones. The inspector promised to keep her informed, though he emphasized that the evidence was building a strong case against Edward Pemberton. The combination of access to explosives, purchase of the specific wiring used, and the damning computer searches created a picture that would be difficult to explain away. After Craddock departed, Miss Marple sat for some time in contemplation, her knitting forgotten in her lap. Through her window she could see the village green, where workers had finally removed the booby-trapped guy under careful supervision. The bonfire had been dismantled as well, the celebration's remnants cleared away as if the annual tradition had never existed. She thought about Edward Pemberton, about the weight of a promise made to a dying mother, and about how far a dutiful son might go to honour that promise. She thought too about moral lines that, once crossed, could never be uncrossed, and about how easy it must be to convince oneself that murder was justified when framed as an act of protection and love. Chapter 5. The Warehouse Investigation. The inspection of Mr. Blackwood's warehouse yielded results that added new dimensions to the investigation. Inspector Craddock arrived at Miss Marple's cottage the following afternoon, his expression troubled as he laid out photographs taken by the forensics team. "The warehouse has a sophisticated security system," he explained, spreading the images across Miss Marple's tea table. "Cameras at all entrances motion-activated, lighting, and a keypad lock that logs every entry and exit. According to the records, only 3 people entered the warehouse during the 2 weeks the guy was stored there. Mr. Blackwood himself, his warehouse manager, and a delivery driver who brought supplies." Miss Marple examined the photographs carefully through her reading glasses. The warehouse was a spacious, well-organized facility where Blackwood stored materials for various business ventures. The guy had occupied a prominent position near the main entrance, draped in protective covering, until Blackwood decided to transport it to the village green. "No signs of forced entry then," Miss Marple observed, "which suggests either that the explosives were already inside the guy when it arrived, or that someone with authorized access planted them later. Did you question the London firm that supposedly made the guy?" "We did," Craddock replied grimly. "That's where things become even more interesting. The firm exists, and did create a guy for Mr. Blackwood, but they swear it was stuffed with traditional materials, straw, old clothing, that sort of thing. They have photographs documenting their work, and they're adamant that no fireworks were involved." Miss Marple set down the photographs, her expression thoughtful. "So the explosives were added after the guy arrived at the warehouse, by someone who had access to both the warehouse and the ability to modify the effigy, without arousing suspicion. That considerably narrows our list of suspects. It gets worse, the inspector continued. We examined the security footage. 2 days before Mr. Blackwood moved the guy to the village green, the cameras recorded Edward Pemberton entering the warehouse. The revelation hung in the air between them. Miss Marple's needles resumed their steady rhythm as she processed this information. Under what pretense did Mr. Pemberton gain access? He told the warehouse manager he needed to borrow some equipment for a corporate event he was organizing. Apparently, Blackwood had agreed to lend him some lighting equipment. The manager let him in, and according to the logs, Pemberton was alone in the warehouse for approximately 45 minutes. Miss Marple could see how the evidence was accumulating into what appeared to be an overwhelming case against Edward Pemberton. The man had means, opportunity, and motive. Yet something continued to trouble her about the neat completeness of it all. Inspector, when you interviewed the warehouse manager, did he mention whether Mr. Pemberton showed any interest in the covered guy effigy during his visit? Craddock consulted his notes. He says Pemberton went directly to the equipment storage area and didn't appear to notice the guy at all, though the manager admits he wasn't watching Pemberton the entire time he was there. 45 minutes is rather a long time to collect some lighting equipment, Miss Marple observed mildly. One wonders what Mr. Pemberton was doing during that period. The inspector nodded agreement. My thought exactly. We're going to bring him in for formal questioning tomorrow. Given the accumulation of evidence, I believe we have grounds for arrest. The computer searches, the access to explosives, the purchase of the specific wiring, and now this warehouse visit. It's difficult to imagine a defence that could adequately explain all these factors. Miss Marple was silent for a moment, watching the autumn rain streak down her windows. Inspector, before you proceed with the arrest, might I suggest one more avenue of investigation? It concerns Mr. Blackwood's development plans and the approval process they underwent with the parish council. Craddock looked puzzled by this apparent change of subject. What bearing does that have on an attempted murder case? Perhaps none, Miss Marple replied, or perhaps everything. You see, I've been making discreet inquiries among my friends on the council, and I've learned something rather interesting. Mr. Blackwood's development proposal was, by all accounts, deeply unpopular and likely to be rejected when it came to vote. Yet somehow it received preliminary approval last month, despite strong opposition. Are you suggesting corruption? The inspector's interest was clearly piqued. I'm suggesting that human beings often have multiple motives for their actions, and that what appears to be simple revenge might be entangled with other, more complex factors. Before you arrest Mr. Pemberton, I think you should examine the voting records of that council meeting most carefully, and perhaps investigate whether any council members received unusual financial considerations around that time. Inspector Craddock promised to look into the matter, though his expression suggested he considered it a tangential issue to the main investigation. As he prepared to leave, Miss Marple called him back with one more question. Inspector, when you do question Mr. Pemberton, would you ask him specifically about his mother's condition and what he believes will happen to her if the development proceeds? I think his answer might be most illuminating. Chapter 6. A Son's Desperate Logic. The questioning of Edward Pemberton took place in the sitting room of his cottage, with Inspector Craddock deciding that a formal interrogation at the police station might be premature, given the man's standing in the community. Miss Marple, at Craddock's unusual invitation, was permitted to observe from an adjacent room, her presence justified as that of a concerned neighbour who might provide character insight. Edward Pemberton was a man of perhaps 45, with the weathered hands of someone who worked with practical materials. His eyes, red-rimmed from lack of sleep, suggested he had anticipated this visit and had spent the intervening days in tormented contemplation of his situation. Mr. Pemberton, Inspector Craddock began formally, I need to ask you about your visit to Mr. Blackwood's warehouse 4 days ago. Can you explain the purpose of that visit? Edward's response came slowly, as if he were weighing each word. Reginald Blackwood had agreed to lend me some stage lighting for a corporate event I was organizing. I went to collect it. The warehouse manager says you were there for 45 minutes. Rather a long time to collect some equipment, wouldn't you say? I was looking for specific items. The warehouse is large, and I'm not familiar with Blackwood's organizational system. Inspector Craddock produced photographs of the fireworks found inside the guy. Do you recognize these explosives, Mr. Pemberton? They're professional-grade fireworks of the sort you're licensed to handle. Edward stared at the photographs, his face paling. They look similar to materials I use in my work, yes, but I had nothing to do with putting them in that guy. And yet, Craddock continued relentlessly, you have the expertise to wire such explosives together. You have access to the specific type of electrical cable used. You were present in the warehouse where the guy was stored, and your computer search history shows extensive research into warehouse fires and fireworks storage accidents. The accumulated evidence presented in this manner seemed overwhelming. Edward's hands trembled as he gripped the arms of his chair. I won't deny that I've been angry about Blackwood's development. I've been desperate, actually, but I didn't plant those explosives. It was at this point that Miss Marple, observing from the next room, noticed something that Inspector Craddock had not. Edward Pemberton's reaction was not that of a man caught in a crime, but of a man horrified by where his own thoughts and plans had led him. There was genuine shock in his expression, as if he were seeing his own intentions reflected back at him in a form he hadn't quite recognized. Inspector Craddock pressed on. "Mr. Pemberton, we know about your mother's condition. We understand that she wishes to die in this cottage, and that Blackwood's development would force her relocation. That must have been an unbearable burden." At the mention of his mother, Edward's composure finally cracked. "She's been in this house for 86 years. She was born in the bedroom upstairs, in the same bed where her own mother was born. She raised her children here, buried her husband from here. Every wall holds her memories, Inspector. She doesn't understand much anymore, but she understands this place. She knows where she belongs." "And Mr. Blackwood's development would take that away from her," Craddock said, not unkindly. "It would kill her," Edward replied, his voice breaking. "Moving her to a care facility will kill her as surely as if someone put a gun to her head. She'll die confused and terrified, in a place that means nothing to her, surrounded by strangers. I promised her she could stay here until the end. I promised her." Miss Marple felt her throat tighten with sympathy even as she recognized the dangerous territory Edward's logic had entered. A promise to a dying parent, the moral imperative to protect one's mother, the calculation that one life taken might save another. She had seen such reasoning before, always with tragic consequences. "So you decided to kill Reginald Blackwood," Inspector Craddock stated, watching Edward's reaction carefully. "No." The denial came with surprising force. "I never intended to kill anyone. I thought about it. God help me, I thought about it constantly. But I couldn't do it. I'm not a murderer, Inspector." "Then explain the explosives, Mr. Pemberton. Explain your warehouse visit. Explain your computer searches." Edward was silent for a long moment, his face a study in anguish. Finally he spoke with the heaviness of a man confessing not to a crime, but to something perhaps worse, the darkness of his own thoughts. "I researched how it might be done. I admit that. I wanted to understand if it was even possible to make Blackwood's death look like an accident. I calculated how much explosive would be needed, what type of wiring would work, where the detonation would need to occur. I told myself I was just exploring the idea, that I would never actually do it." "But you went to his warehouse," Craddock pressed. "Yes, I went there, and I looked at the covered guy sitting near the entrance, and I realized that if I were going to act, that would be the perfect vehicle. It was already filled with straw, already destined for fire. It would be simple to replace the straw with explosives. Blackwood would work alone in the warehouse on Bonfire night, preparing his materials as he always does. The explosion would look like a terrible accident with improperly stored fireworks." "So you did plant the explosives?" "No," Edward said firmly. "I stood in that warehouse for 20 minutes knowing I could do it, knowing exactly how I would do it, and I couldn't bring myself to cross that line. I'm not that person, Inspector. However desperate I am, however much I love my mother, I'm not a murderer. I collected my lighting equipment and I left." Chapter 7. Corruption Beneath the Surface. Inspector Craddock was inclined to view Edward Pemberton's confession of contemplation without action as a clever attempt to explain away damning evidence while maintaining innocence. However, Miss Marple had observed something in the man's testimony that gave her pause. She had seen true surprise when the explosives were described, as if Edward had confronted the physical reality of plans he had only considered abstractly. "Inspector," she said during their consultation that evening, "I wonder if we're looking at this from the wrong angle. Mr. Pemberton clearly had murderous thoughts, but perhaps someone else acted on them." Craddock frowned sceptically. "You're suggesting conspiracy? That someone knew what Pemberton was planning and executed the plan he couldn't complete?" "Not quite," Miss Marple replied carefully. "I'm suggesting that Mr. Pemberton's research and preparations may have been observed and copied by someone with different motives and fewer moral restraints, someone who knew about Pemberton's expertise and could use it to their advantage. But who? And why would anyone else want Blackwood dead? That, Inspector, is why I encouraged you to investigate the Council's development approval. Did you examine those matters?" Craddock pulled out a manila folder, his expression darkening. "I did, and what I found is deeply troubling. 3 council members who previously opposed Blackwood's development suddenly changed their votes to approval. The shift secured preliminary authorization. And did these 3 experience any unusual financial good fortune around that time?" "2 of them did," the inspector confirmed. "Councillor Hammond purchased a new car beyond his income's allowance. Councillor Peters paid off substantial gambling debts. The third, Councillor Briggs, appears clean, though we're still investigating." Miss Marple nodded as if this confirmed her suspicions. "Inspector, did any of these council members have particular expertise in explosives or electrical work?" Craddock consulted his notes. "Councillor Hammond worked in construction before retiring. He would have general knowledge of electrical systems. Councillor Peters—" he looked up sharply. "Peters served in the Royal Engineers during the war. He would have extensive explosives and demolition knowledge." "How very interesting," Miss Marple murmured. "And I don't suppose Councillor Peters had any connection to Mr. Blackwood's warehouse?" Craddock made several phone calls, his expression growing progressively grimmer. When he set down the receiver, his voice was tight. "Peters worked as a security consultant after the war. He installed Blackwood's warehouse security system 5 years ago. He has complete access to override codes and camera blind spots." Miss Marple set down her teacup with deliberate care. "Then I believe, Inspector, we need to reconsider who truly created that explosive guy effigy, and why." Chapter 8. The Web of Evidence. The revelation about Councillor Peters' access to Blackwood's warehouse transformed the investigation's direction. Inspector Craddock obtained a warrant to search Peters' home and business premises, while Miss Marple quietly pursued her own inquiries among St. Mary Mead's network of observant residents. What emerged was a picture of corruption far deeper than simple bribery. Reginald Blackwood had not merely offered money to secure approval for his development. He had systematically exploited the personal weaknesses of 3 council members, using their gambling debts, financial difficulties, and family problems as leverage to ensure their cooperation. Councillor Peters had been particularly vulnerable. His gambling addiction had spiraled out of control, leaving him deeply indebted to dangerous people. Blackwood had offered not just money, but protection from his creditors. In exchange, Peters had voted for the development and had agreed to use his influence to sway other council members. But there was an additional dimension to their relationship that made Blackwood's murder logical from Peters's perspective. The developer had been keeping detailed records of all bribes and corrupt dealings, ostensibly as insurance against betrayal. Peters had discovered these records during a meeting at Blackwood's warehouse and realized he was being blackmailed in perpetuity. If Blackwood exposed the corruption, Peters would face criminal charges and imprisonment. Peters had been looking for a way to eliminate Blackwood without suspicion falling on him, Inspector Craddock explained to Miss Marple. When he became aware of Edward Pemberton's research into warehouse accidents and fireworks explosions, he saw his opportunity. Miss Marple sipped her tea thoughtfully. How did Councillor Peters learn of Mr. Pemberton's plans? We're still piecing that together, but it appears Peters had been monitoring several of the families opposing the development, concerned they might discover the bribery. He noticed Pemberton's computer searches and warehouse visit. Rather than report this suspicious behaviour, Peters decided to complete what Pemberton had planned but couldn't execute. The technical analysis of the explosive guy supported this theory. The wiring and explosives matched materials Peters had access to through his security consulting business, not the professional fireworks Pemberton used. More significantly, the device's construction showed military expertise consistent with Peters's Royal Engineers training, not the theatrical knowledge of someone who worked with fireworks displays. Peters used his override access to enter Blackwood's warehouse undetected, Craddock continued. He unpacked the professionally made guy, removed the straw stuffing and carefully replaced it with explosives wired to detonate when exposed to flame. His plan was elegant in its simplicity. The guy would remain in storage until Bonfire night, when Blackwood would transport it to his workshop for final preparations before the celebration. The explosion would kill Blackwood and destroy the blackmail evidence, appearing as a tragic accident. But the plan went wrong when Mr. Blackwood decided to deliver the guy early, Miss Marple observed. Exactly. Peters had no way to know Blackwood would make that spontaneous decision. Instead of detonating safely in an isolated warehouse, the explosive guy was placed on the village green where dozens of people would be present. What was meant to be a targeted assassination became potential mass murder. Miss Marple's expression was grave, and rather than warning anyone or attempting to prevent the catastrophe, Councillor Peters simply hoped his device wouldn't be discovered. We found evidence that Peters was actually present at the celebration, Craddock confirmed. He was positioned where he could observe the bonfire, presumably ready to flee if the explosion occurred. When young Tommy Belden discovered the fireworks, Peters quietly left the scene. The inspector's team had also uncovered the damning evidence of Blackwood's blackmail operation. Hidden in the developer's office safe were detailed records of every bribe, every corrupt dealing, and every compromised official. The documentation would have ensured Blackwood's control over the council indefinitely, making him virtually untouchable in future development plans. Peters wasn't just protecting himself, Miss Marple observed. He was protecting all 3 corrupted council members. Once Blackwood was dead, the blackmail evidence could be destroyed, and their crimes would remain hidden. That appears to be correct, Craddock agreed, though I doubt Hammond and Briggs knew anything about the murder plot. Chapter 9. Confrontation and Confession. The arrest of Councillor Peters was conducted with quiet efficiency, the inspector choosing to execute the warrant early one morning when few villagers would witness the spectacle. Miss Marple had requested permission to be present during the subsequent interrogation, arguing that her understanding of village dynamics might prove useful. Inspector Craddock, having learned to trust her instincts, agreed. Peters sat in the interview room with the stiff posture of a military man facing court-martial. His weathered face showed no emotion as Craddock laid out the evidence methodically. The override access to Blackwood's security system, the technical expertise required to construct the explosive device, the opportunity and motive stemming from Blackwood's blackmail, the presence at the celebration during the near catastrophe. "You've constructed an interesting theory, Inspector," Peters said, when Craddock finished. "But theory isn't evidence. Many people had reason to want Blackwood dead, and my wartime service hardly makes me unique in possessing explosives knowledge." "Your military records show specialized training in demolition and sabotage," Craddock countered. "The construction of the device in the guy matches techniques taught in Royal Engineers training, not civilian fireworks handling." Peters' expression didn't waver. Coincidence. Edward Pemberton had equal opportunity and stronger motivation. His mother's situation made him desperate. It was at this point that Miss Marple spoke for the first time, her gentle voice cutting through the tension. "Mr. Peters, did you know that Edward Pemberton's mother has only weeks to live? The doctors confirmed it yesterday. She won't survive to see the spring regardless of where she lives." Peters' controlled facade cracked slightly. "I didn't know that." "Of course you didn't," Miss Marple continued quietly. "Because you weren't really concerned with the Pemberton family's tragedy. You were focused on your own survival, on escaping the consequences of your corruption. Edward Pemberton contemplated murder to protect his dying mother. You committed murder to protect yourself." "I didn't murder anyone," Peters insisted, though his voice lacked conviction. "No," Miss Marple agreed. "You attempted murder and very nearly caused a massacre through your incompetence. When Mr. Blackwood moved the guy to the village green ahead of schedule, you should have warned someone. You should have prevented the explosion. But you did nothing, willing to let dozens of innocent people die if it meant destroying the evidence of your corruption." Inspector Craddock produced a plastic evidence bag containing fragments of wire. "We found these in your workshop, Mr. Peters. The composition matches exactly the wiring used in the explosive device. We also found residue of the specific explosives used, along with your notes detailing Blackwood's warehouse routine and security blind spots. Peters stared at the evidence, his military bearing finally collapsing. Blackwood was destroying people, he said quietly. Not just through his development, but through his blackmail. He had turned us into his puppets. Hammond, Briggs, myself. We were trapped. He would have controlled the council for years, pushing through whatever projects enriched him while holding our crimes over us. So, you decided to kill him, Craddock stated. I decided to free us, Peters corrected. And yes, to save myself from prison. I knew Pemberton was researching ways to make Blackwood's death look accidental. I followed his computer searches, watched him visit the warehouse. When he left without acting, I realized I could complete what he'd started. Everyone would assume Pemberton was responsible. The evidence would point to him. But the plan failed when Blackwood moved the guy early. Peter's face showed genuine anguish. I had no way to know he would do that. When I saw the guy sitting on the village green surrounded by families, I was horrified. But if I'd warned anyone, I would have revealed my involvement. I convinced myself the device might not be discovered, that perhaps Blackwood would cancel the burning for some reason. You were willing to gamble with dozens of lives, Miss Marple said, her voice heavy with judgment. I was desperate, Peters replied. Desperate people make terrible choices, Miss Marple. Surely you understand that. I understand that desperation can drive people to darkness, Miss Marple acknowledged. But I also understand the difference between Edward Pemberton's struggle with his conscience and your willingness to sacrifice innocence to save yourself. Mr. Pemberton discovered he couldn't cross that moral line. You crossed it without hesitation. Peters had no response to this, his silence more eloquent than any confession. Chapter 10. Justice and its Complications. The trial of Councillor Peters became a sensation that extended far beyond St. Mary Mead. The case involved not just attempted murder, but a web of corruption that had compromised the village's governance. Hammond and Briggs, the other two council members who had accepted Blackwood's bribes, were charged with corruption. They received lesser sentences in exchange for testimony against Peters and cooperation in exposing the full extent of Blackwood's criminal operation. Edward Pemberton was never charged with any crime. Inspector Craddock, recognizing that murderous thoughts were not the same as murderous actions, chose not to pursue charges for the computer searches and warehouse visit. The evidence that Peters had copied Pemberton's research actually helped establish that Pemberton himself hadn't built the explosive device. It's a strange sort of justice, Diana observed to Miss Marple as they attended the final court proceedings. Pemberton contemplated murder but is free, while Peters executed murder and goes to prison. The law recognizes an essential truth, Miss Marple replied, that human beings are defined not by their darkest thoughts, but by their actions. Edward Pemberton faced his moment of choice, and couldn't bring himself to commit murder, no matter how desperately he wanted to save his mother. That restraint, that fundamental recognition of moral boundaries, is what separates him from Peters. The trial revealed troubling truths about Reginald Blackwood as well. While he was the victim of attempted murder, he was also the architect of systematic corruption. The discovery of his blackmail operation led to the development proposal being permanently rejected and criminal charges being filed against his estate. The village green would remain untouched, preserved for future generations. Edward Pemberton's mother passed away peacefully in her cottage 2 months after the trial, holding her son's hand in the bedroom where she had been born. Edward sat with Miss Marple afterward, his grief mingled with relief. She never knew how close I came to becoming a murderer, he said quietly. She died believing I was a good man. You are a good man, Miss Marple replied firmly. A good man who faced terrible temptation and ultimately chose correctly. That struggle, that moment of turning away from darkness, requires strength that many people never possess. But I wanted to do it, Edward confessed. For weeks I wanted nothing more than to kill Blackwood and make it look like an accident. The human heart is capable of terrible desires, Miss Marple acknowledged. What matters is that when the moment came, you couldn't follow through. Your conscience, your essential decency, proved stronger than your desperation. That's not weakness, Mr. Pemberton. That's the truest kind of strength. The case left Miss Marple with complicated feelings about justice and morality. Peters would spend years in prison for his attempted murder and willingness to cause mass casualties. Blackwood, though dead, was revealed as a corrupt manipulator who had poisoned the village's governance. Pemberton was free but would carry the weight of his murderous contemplations forever. There are no simple villains or heroes in this story, she observed to Inspector Craddock during one of their final consultations. Only human beings facing impossible choices and revealing their characters through their responses. You sound almost sympathetic to Peters, Craddock noted. Not sympathetic, Miss Marple corrected, but understanding. Blackwood's blackmail created a situation where Peters felt trapped with no legal escape. That doesn't justify murder, but it explains the desperation that led him there. If Blackwood had not been corrupt himself, Peters would never have been in a position to commit such a crime. The village slowly recovered from the scandal, though the Bonfire Night celebration was suspended for several years out of respect for how close the community had come to tragedy. When it finally resumed, young Tommy Belden, now recognized as a hero, was given the honor of lighting the bonfire. The guy that year was simple and traditional, stuffed only with straw. Miss Marple attended the celebration with Diana, watching the flames climb into the November sky. She thought about the nature of community, about how even the most peaceful villages harbored darkness, and about the eternal human struggle between love and violence, protection and destruction. Do you think we'll ever know what really went through Edward Pemberton's mind when he stood in that warehouse? Diana asked. I think he looked into his own heart and found both the capacity for murder and the strength to resist it, Miss Marple replied. That knowledge will haunt him, but it will also remind him of who he truly is. Sometimes our darkest moments teach us our most important lessons about ourselves. The bonfire crackled and sparked against the cold November sky, a symbol of tradition preserved and community renewed. And Miss Marple, watching the flames dance, reflected that justice, like fire, could both illuminate and destroy, depending on how carefully it was tended.